Good afternoon, everyone. Here in Beirut it's afternoon or good morning or good evening, wherever you are. We're pleased today to hold this webinar for two reasons at least. The first one relates to the topic that we are going to discuss, which is a very important topic in terms of public policy, and mainly it's a building block in any process of curbing corruption in countries that are crippled by this phenomenon. And we'll see how important it is not only for Lebanon, but for Lebanon's partners also. And this is why we are very honored to have Ambassador Tarraf representing you, who will say a few words of opening and his few takeaways on this issue. I know that the EU is very keen on having this law passed and implemented in Lebanon. The second reason why we are also very for this is that this webinar is inaugurating a relation that the Issam Fares for Public Policy and International Affairs is starting with an extremely important partner, EuroMESCO, a very important network of centers around the Mediterranean. This is our first event with EuroMESCO, and I thank EuroMESCO for this opportunity. I hope that we will do increasingly things together. This is why we are really honored today to have this webinar. The way this conversation will be organized is the following. Ambassador Tarraf, on behalf of the European Union, will say a few words, not protocolar, but also highlighting the importance of this public procurement law. Then free Ambassador Tarraf, because we know that he's very busy. Unfortunately, he'll probably have to leave us, and we'll pursue the discussion with three specialists. Lamia Moubayed from the Institut of Finance, a prominent prominent public policy specialist who works on finance and public procurement, has been key in drafting this law, in preparing this law. She will present to us and present the many aspects that are problematic. She will be followed by Maître Karim Daher, a very well-known lawyer in Lebanon, but also the head of ALDIC, an important organization that deals with the protection of taxpayers. And Maître Daher will shed a light on maybe the limits or the other aspects that are leading the law in the Lebanese context, something he really masters. And then we'll have Mr. Piotr-Nils Gorecki, who's a senior advisor with SIGMA, a consultancy works with OECD, and who was also very much involved in the crafting and drafting of this public procurement law, who will give us this perspective, but also a comparative perspective, let's say the reading of the European Union towards this very important issue. Without ado, and with my warm thanks to you, Ambassador Tarraf, for participating, I will give you the floor for a few words of introduction, and we look forward to seeing you much more often and regularly with us in the we have at IFI. Very much.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thanks to the Issam Fares Institute of the AUB for organizing today's webinar and for inviting me to this webinar, which is held under the title Public Procurement Law: What are the challenges for implementation? Now, admittedly, this topic seems a bit nerdy or niche at the moment in which the government, just after its inception, seems paralyzed again and blocked over the fate of the investigation of Tariq Bitar, the Tayoune or Ain al-Rumaini incidents, the rift with some Arab Gulf states over Minister Kordahi's future. Geopolitics and its repercussions on the Lebanese scene. On connaît la chanson. But I remain convinced that Lebanon and Lebanese decision makers have a margin to define their priorities and shape the future of their unique country, despite the appearances and despite the conversations around dinner tables, which tend to turn around grand political designs and schemes and grand conspiracies. When I arrived in Lebanon as a diplomat 2 years ago, I did what we are supposed to do as diplomats. I paid a courtesy visit to Lebanese leaders and decision makers. I have forgotten by now what we had discussed in detail back then. But one detail I remember very vividly. All my interlocutors, all of them, without exception, kullun yani kullun, complained about the rampant corruption in the country. I found this a bit strange as a way of introduction to this country, to a foreigner, by its leaders and decision makers. But I have learned over time that this is part of the national narrative shared by all Lebanese, including their leaders. Lebanon has a problem with corruption. There is no doubt about that, and I don't think that anybody contests that. Let me express my hope that at least starting to address this issue might create a virtuous cycle, rebuild the trust of the Lebanese in state institutions, and help build a shared sense of destiny, which might help weather the rough winds of geopolitics. Perhaps, hopefully. I'm convinced rebuilding trust, building a nation begins at home, not in Tehran, not in Riyadh or Washington, Paris, or Brussels for that matter. The public procurement law passed by Parliament in June 2021 is a crucial element of creating transparency and accountability in public administration and in fighting corruption. The passing of this law is a major success and an important contribution to the reform of public administration. In German, we have a saying which says, successes have many fathers. Today, in a more gender-neutral perspective, we would say many parents. Failures are orphans. So because this success has many parents, let me mention and praise some of the parents. I would like to start with Lamia Moubayed, who tirelessly worked to get this done with her team of the Institut des Finances. I would also like to pay tribute to Yassin Jaber, who in his very wise way steered the Parliament through a difficult consultation period, and the trademark of which was in its inclusive character. He made sure that we all had a say, and I remember that I was also invited at some point to parliamentary hearings over this law. I would like also to thank and pay tribute to the Tender Board and its Director General, Jean Allier, to the Ministry of Justice and OMSA. Sorry, just getting cold. The international community has also been supportive of this process. The EU is proud to have been a partner in this process. We have funded SIGMA, who has provided technical assistance and expertise to the Institut des Finances and has been instrumental in drafting the law. The World Bank, the AfD, and CSOs have accompanied this process. This is a common endeavor. Now, the title of this webinar is The Public Procurement Law, What are the Challenges for Implementation? And I think the title is very well chosen. The real test, I believe, is still ahead of us. Will this law be ever implemented by the letter and in the spirit in which it has been drafted? I learned only recently that Parliament in Lebanon has passed more than 70 laws, 70, which have been ignored by the executive, never been implemented. The implementation never started on these laws. This is why I believe we have to focus now to ensure that this law is implemented. And we need to keep up public attention to what happens next, to the next phase. We need to keep talking about this law and its importance. And this is why I believe this webinar is highly relevant, and it's very pertinent, and it's very timely. Thank you again for organizing. And it is actually my pleasure to stay with you a bit. I don't have to run immediately, and I would be very keen to listen to what the colleagues have to say about the law itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear. Thank you, dear Ambassador. It's really a pleasure that you're staying with us, and thank you for your candidness in these observations. I'm sure that by now the Lebanese are starting to know that you don't hash your words usually to say something, and this is for us here in. Without ado, I'll pass the floor to Lamia. Lamia, take a little bit of time, something like maybe 12 to 15 minutes, if you want to lay out the different aspects of the law, since you have worked on it. Help us understand a bit more what it is about, or the many layers of and its main impediments. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all. Thank you, Ambassador Tarraf, for staying with us, and for it's a very important show of commitment and to the importance that you yourself have given to the law. I remember very well this first session where you actually was among those who opened the hearings in Parliament by saying how much this law is important. And you remember very well, because Mr. Yassin Jaber kept on repeating it all through the hearings, that it is the priority number 3 after electricity and after also the judiciary, which was the across whole of government or whole of society reform. So thank you very much for all the importance and all the support, and thank you AUB Issam Fares Institute and EuroMESCO for bringing us together, inviting this timely discussion today at the spotlight, despite everything that is going on. And one thing is that despite everything that is going on, we are persisting and we are continuing, because people are, and we're doing so because not only because we are public servants and public leaders committed to advancing reforms in government, and specifically financial governance reforms key to the future of Lebanon, because also as citizens, as people, as human beings, we're tired to be caught by this geopolitics and with these grand schemes. We're tired of losing all what makes Lebanon so important, especially after the explosion, this joy and this capacity to imagine the future. Public management need to be about anticipating and projecting ourselves in the future, and we need to all work at reinstating it as a science and as a practice. I teach public management at AUB. I teach it also at St. Joseph University, and I see how my young students, how they interact when they learn the science of public management. And I remember one of them telling me, now I can talk about public policy and not about politics in my circles. So it's important to keep an eye on these young generation. And talking about problems, yes, you are right, Ambassador, around dinner tables is important, but working at solving them, even in the midst of the most unimaginably difficult situation, exactly what you are doing is a source of joy, of an internal peace. So that's my little, your talk just incited this opening. So thank you for inspiring it. Now, public procurement reform is not that technical anymore after all what these years have been. It's now talked in circles. People relate it to corruption a lot. They understand the impact on the quality of their life, on the quality of infrastructure. The press has done a wonderful job. The civil society also has done a wonderful job explaining the link with everyday life. Procuring, I keep hearing this example about the army socks. Your army, imagine that you are procuring socks for your army, for your soldier, and imagine that why do you need to buy the low quality socks that makes the soldier hot in summer and cold in winter? This is public procurement, and it's in a simple way, but it is behind it is a whole wall of corruption, and we are strongly, working at dismantling it, building on the experiences of the international community and the countries that have, done a better job at that. Public procurement is a big business. It is the public market. It is what the government buys, what the country buys. In Lebanon, it's 6.5% at central GDP at central level. And this has been for the past years, recognizably by everybody, subject to mismanagement and to entrenched state capture. Bad procurement of fuel oil for electricity generation alone costed the country and the citizen tremendous amounts of money. I will not, put a figure on that. Recent studies done by many institutions, including the Issam Fares Institute, have shown that politically connected firms are partitioning valuable procurement contracts, especially in the infrastructure sector. Public works are prone to sabotage and are therefore distributed among elites from their inception, leading to poor quality of services, quoting one of the studies. So, why was that? All that happened because the Lebanon procurement system lagged behind developing country, leading to inefficiency, to waste. And according to the World Economic Forum, Lebanon was classified 130 over 137 in quality of infrastructure. So you might want to put a link on that to understand how much fraud, corruption, mismanagement, misprocurement costed Lebanon so far. So after a 2-year-long process, we now have a modern public procurement law 244/2021. It was promulgated on June 30, 2021. And the principles, the Constitutional Council's decision, which rejected the petition against it, further validated not only its content, but also the rationale and the principles it was built on. And these are the 12 OECD principles of public procurement, which promote transparency, efficiency, competition, integration with budget, etc. And we were able to do that because first we were able to build and anchor a vision based on evidence. And this is, by evidence, I mean the MAPS assessment, which produced convincing gap analysis, which produced evidence-grounded recommendations based on comparative analysis and on benchmarking. And they showed, I opened the bracket to say, on MAPS, we really saw the real problem. We knew there was a problem, but we could just measure it. Lebanon got 11 criteria out of 210 right on the MAPS exercise. So we grounded the process in evidence, and so it was unbeaten. The second anchor was principles, and this is where the OECD guiding principle came extremely handy. We again reinvented them and combined them into 8 guiding principles that were the principles that guided the law all throughout. So I said inclusiveness, budget integration, competition, efficiency, transparency, integrity. So accountability, professionalization, and sustainability. Every principle was translated into articles in the law, which made it extremely strong. So, and made also the discussion in Parliament easy, because every time the discussion went off the board to kind of counter the principles, we had these very strong arguments. Let's go back to the principle and see if the point of view that was presented in Parliament actually was in line or not in line with the principles. And I'm very happy to say that we had an excellent parliamentary committee who was extremely active in the discussions, but also extremely open to looking and to discussing and to looking at experiences outside Lebanon while we were discussing and doing the hearings in Parliament. So I said evidence was first, second principle, and third immersion. By immersion, I mean in opening the floor for all the actors to participate in the making of the law, making the process an instrument to transform how public procurement is perceived by both the spenders and the buyers, but also by the community of private sector businesses and the civil society. And here it was very important because public procurement system can be really enablers of transforming how public money is spent. Yes, but also the role of responsible businesses is important, because when they believe in competition and they interact with a law that allows or open the doors for competition, that breaks the barrier to competition, they will immediately support you. And this is what happened. So we had a full backing from the responsible businesses community, from the media also, and from all the community groups who were extremely active in the dialogue and in the making of the law a better law. So these were the three paths that created this cross-sector partnerships, and they were considered, of course, conceived from the start, but we made the making of the law such an enjoyable and such a fulfilling also experience for us at the Institute of Finance, but also for all the participants from the public sector. And allow me to say here that we wouldn't have been able to make advance without these public servants who were believers from the start with us, who were the fighters against corruptions, who are the resistance from the inside, who were sick, tired of seeing all these public practices made, but also being as public servants, blamed of doing. And one of them is, of course, Jean Aliye, who I salute, but let me assure you that there are so many Jean Aliyes in the government and the Lebanese institutions. You will be very, very proud to know each and everyone. And I had the pleasure to work with each and everyone, and some of them may be joining this discussion. So chapeau bas for all their effort, but also and a big thanks for the help they provided for us understanding the problems and finding together the right solutions that were then translated in the law. So that was then. Now we have a law, and we have, of course, with the help of SIGMA and the review that they did it, a better version of it, and now we're all confronted with this deadline of August 2022. So we're moving from legislation to implementation, and this move is going to be very difficult, because enacting the law is doing a law or writing a law is one thing, and enacting it is another, and making it work is a totally different ball game. How are we going to do it? First, the way we're going to keep on having the same architecture of consultations and consultancy. The MAPS committee, which is composed of more than 15 public institutions, in addition to private sector representatives and civil society, are going to continue to act as, let's say, the unofficial committee following the implementation of the law. So first, there is a national strategy in the making. This is the national strategy for public procurement reform. It's now in English. We have it in English and Arabic version. And we hope to it has been put to consultation, and we hope to present it to the Council of Ministers in case this works. If it doesn't, we will continue to use it as a framing and guide. This strategy has an action plan built on 4 strategic areas of focus. So first of all, the regulatory and policy framework to be brought in line with good international practices. The second is everything that has to do about the institutional framework and building the two main elements of the law, the 2 main new institutions. So the regulator, which is the Procurement Regulatory Authority, and the Complaints Authority, and this is a second extremely important authority that needs to be created, nominated, and framed. The third axis will be all that relates with the operation of the system, including the e-procurement system. And the fourth is promoting and developing a full capacity inside government, but also in municipality, to actually implement the law. So these 4 areas, which are parallel a little bit to the MAPS areas, are declined into more than 80 actions. And these actions need to be operational, a lot of support. Technical support, human resources support, and financial support. And what we are doing now with the help of our partners is to lobby the international community around this action plan so that we could meet the challenge of August 2022. You all know very well the situation of the Lebanese administration in general, but also of institutes like us, like the Institute of Finance. And it's a crucial period. We need to keep the rhythm, we need to keep the force, and we need to keep the people inside the institutions. And unless we find the solution to do that, this whole investment might be jeopardized. So our objective is to try to leverage the support of the international community to keep the rhythm and to keep this reform momentum and to achieve results, because results will bring results. And if we do a good job for August 2022, it will be a locomotive and a lot of push so that we do better for the next year. So I'm not going to list everything that we're proposing in the national strategy, but I'm going to just name one of them, and which is building human capacity inside government. And this is what today is needed. And by capacity today, capacity is, I don't only talk about the technical capacity, but also this human capacity to continue doing the job of public service. Finally, I would like to end by thanking each and every one of you for listening to our propos, and just confirming that I represent a wonderful team of Lebanese public servants at the Institute of Finance and in Lebanon who are proud of being public servants. Thank you.
Very much, Lamia. Thank you for this presentation. What I keep in mind is something important you said. Despite the erosion of the in Lebanon, despite the total collapse of this country, there are still some brilliant and dedicated and really devoted civil and public servants in the country, and these are the treasury that we should keep and preserve if one day a state has to be rebuilt in Lebanon. I'm sure that Karim Daher have plenty of things to add and to say. You probably have read extensively the law, and you will shed a light on the limitation of that, especially in the more global Lebanese context that you know so much of. Karim, the floor.
Thank you, Joe. I would like to thank first Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, as well as EuroMESCO and the EU mission for their invitation to participate as a speaker on this high-level panel to this webinar, very important webinar on the challenges for the implementation of the public procurement law. I will address the subject of implementation from transparency and accountability perspectives in both public procurement and public finance. Actually, public procurement is undoubtedly one of Lebanese state's greatest corruption risks. Decades of widespread corruption and absence of transparency and accountability have rendered the public sector dysfunctional, with steadily declining living standard and failing infrastructure, and on the top of all of this, the aversion of the state by the citizens. It is against that background that the recent public procurement law has been introduced as key structural reform to addressing the deepening prevailing crisis and one of the conditionality aids to be channeled to support economic recovery. However, the reform of public procurement regime from transparency's perspective goes hand in hand with the reform of the public finance. If we consider that a public procurement reform relates to the good execution of the public expenditure, the public finance reform relates for its part to the decision-making and adoption process, which is much more at stake and critical to ensure that budgets are allocated where there is the most need and that leakage due to mismanagement and corruption is minimized. In short, we may say that in both segments, we need transparency to ensure that public money is well spent. From transparency of public procurement perspective, I may say that public procurement is an activity that is highly vulnerable to corruption because of the complexity of the process and the multitude of stakeholders. The absence of transparency and accountability in the Lebanese public procurement process during the past 3 decades has caused revenue losses and budget shortfalls and impeded competitiveness and economic development. Building upon the reforming provisions of the new public procurement law number 244, several progresses have been achieved in several domains and fields, among which the establishment and adoption of public database and e-platform to compile and diffuse information, e-procurement mechanisms, standardized documents for tenders, codes of ethics for all concerned parties, regular training to build capacities and raise awareness, and clear mechanism of supervision and dealing with complaints. It was founded on major guiding principles as aforesaid and aforementioned by Lamia, such as inclusiveness, accountability, effectiveness, professionalization, competition, transparency, and integrity. It is expected to be followed and backed soon by the drafting of priority secondary legislation. Notwithstanding the valuable reform, some observations and recommendations can be made with a view to enrich the discussion and suggest additional useful improvements. First, as regard to the beneficial ownership and public registry, we know that corruption schemes often rely on government contracts to conceal illicit money flows because it can be difficult to see who the real winners of the contracts are and where the money goes. Controlling beneficial owners may be hidden under layers and layers of corporations. This is why the selection process must be fair and open to ensure these deals are based on prior performance, best value for money, and in the interest of taxpayers. Combining open contracting data and beneficial ownership can make it easier to detect corruption risks. Beneficial ownership information should be more transparent by having a national centralized registry for holding information on all legal vehicles and bidders. Public access may allow more actors to verify information and create a deterrent effect. A complementary approach for the procurement sector will consist in appointing a resident lawyer or chartered accountant to certify the declared beneficial ownership data and to be held liable if it turns out to be wrong. Second proposal concerns the public right to information. despite the existing tension between the right to privacy and the public right to information, it should be recognized that any financial activity or contract having externalities and impact on public funds should not benefit of secrecy, undermining any control or accountability. The decision number 17 of the former government dated May 12, 2021, requesting the waiver of bank secrecy in public procurement should be reactivated and adopted in this regard. Third proposal, to have a deterrent sanction regime, despite the several provisions concerning the sanction in the new law. The deterrent sanction regime, such as large fines, substantial enough to change incentives. We know now that the financial sanctions that have been provided in the law are based on the minimum salary and are not anymore up to date. We also may consider removal of license and eligibility for tendering should apply to strengthen and secure the enforcement of the provision of the law. And other original sanctions to encourage compliance should be considered as well, involving losing the benefit of personal limited liability in companies, or the rights to dividend or to voting for persons who does not appear in the register of beneficial owner, of course. Hence, real beneficial owners may be deterred from using nominees. Bribers and kickbacks, and this is a very important point that has not been highlighted in the law and nor in any other discussion. Those bribes and kickbacks are usually registered in the books as other charges, the books of the companies and of the bidders, and requalified by the tax authorities as hidden distribution, and are added to the net profit, annual net profits, and they will be liable also to a tax on dividend. However, those payments are very dangerous because the whole criminal circuit remains hidden. We do not ask those companies to disclose the name of the person who have benefited from those payments. The concerned contracting parties should be forced to disclose the beneficiaries of such payments at the risk of being severely sanctioned. 4, concerning the enablers. The enablers are financial, lawyers, chartered account, and other related professionals that facilitate all the schemes that are put in place to hide beneficial owners or to hide any mechanism that will include any corruption act. Those enablers should be keen to act ethically and apply permanent due diligence procedures on their customers. They should notify the concerned authorities of the details of any suspected operation in terms of corruption, briberies, and fraud, as well as keen to avoid reporting of the beneficial ownership. We should also join open government partnership and open contracting partnership, who are very important. And we may also involve non-state actors and civil society, because the CSO may play the role of watching dog and fight against corruption and misuse of public funds. Their involvement can increase the impartiality and objectivity of the reviews and survey. Concerning the transparency of public finance, we should know that well-designed fiscal institution can promote credibility and ensure appropriate use of public resources. Targeted structural reforms should include, in addition to public procurement, enhancing accountability and transparency in national budget and public finance, which is essential to ensure that public services are well delivered and that resources are being allocated to priority programs and needs. With this end in view, several measures should be considered, among which the change in the composition of public expenditure. A substantial change should occur in the composition of public expenditure, with less spending on wages, indemnities, and subsidies, and more on capital expenditure in basic public services, notably health and education, to ensure greater inclusiveness and higher growth. Second, to strengthen and improve the internal procedure of control. A special attention should be provided to the improvement of internal controls framework, audit offices notably, to manage the budget execution and reporting process, as well as to reduce budget overruns and unauthorized expenditures. Reports and findings from these audits should be released to the public and the legislators to strengthen oversight and the government implementation issue. We should also address the idea or the proposal of improving the accountability for execution of the budget through a new concept of the organic budget law. This is a concept for performance budgeting in order to take into account both the economic forecast and the fiscal targets, and to hold the government responsible of the outcomes, which is not applied by now. We should also abide with the principle of unity in the budget preparation. Finally, and notwithstanding the foregoing, it has become all clear that despite the various efforts to draft and pass anti-corruption laws and strategy culminating in the recent public procurement law, as well as improvement to the existing legal framework, it may be feared that the whole reforming process is unlikely to be effectively well implemented due to the systemic nature of the corruption and lack of political will among Lebanon's ruling elites that are reluctant to engage in the transparency and accountability path in order not to be held or hold themselves accountable for the socio-economic collapse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karim. I think these observations are very useful. We'll get back to Lamia Moubayed in a minute after Mr. Gorecki's intervention for her to react on this. And I would like to remind the audience that we have a long Q&A session after Mr. Gorecki's intervention, and you are encouraged to write your questions directly on the Q&A chat box in order for us to put them to the speakers. Mr. Gorecki, please, the floor is yours for some maybe additions and mainly for comparative also approaches to this.
Thank you so much. Let me start by saying thank you to all of you, the organizers, for allowing myself, my organization, to be part of this webinar, to be able to give a few words of what we feel are your next steps, based on an experience that we have in following and encouraging public procurement reform in European neighborhood countries, and countries that have the plans to accede to the European Union one way or the other. I would like to laud the excellent cooperation we have had with the Institut de Finance, with other Lebanese institutions, and of course the EU delegation in Beirut. Now, just a very few words about SIGMA. We're basically a joint initiative of the OECD and the EU. We're principally financed by the EU, existing since 1992, and we're a small organization, small unit that works within the OECD. We're all former member state officials that have been part of public administration reform, including public procurement reform in their own member states. I myself am Polish and had also the pleasure of being part of Poland's introduction of a public procurement system back in the mid-90s and early 2000s. Actually, when I read about your efforts and your work, a lot is still very much the same. The real aim of this presentation is to try and catch and summarize some of the main lessons learned from this 20-year period that SIGMA has been working with countries on procurement and power reform, and maybe share with you a few thoughts on what we think needs still to be encouraged over the next years when you will be implementing your reforms. It's not, of course, an exclusive list. You will notice that, and you have seen even in your last few years, that the size, the scope, the width of procurement has changed over the years, and it still remains a moving target. It is a more and more complex puzzle, both structurally, but also in its implementation. There are more legal instruments, more policy areas, There are new coordination needs. When one starts off, one thinks, okay, we do the law, we train a few people, off we go. As you all know, that is not how it really works. There are exclusions, there are thresholds, there are international standards, there are market influences. Some of the original legislative framework is written rather for big contracts. It turns out that the majority of contracts in most countries are quite small, and you need to be able to design a system that is created for serving both these worlds. The correct setting of national thresholds, for example, is a major challenge. In our experience, national rules and procedures need to offer a necessary degree of simplification and flexibility for these small tenders. The currently functioning institutional setup in the public procurement area was basically created in the last 10, 15 years, and most countries have very similar features. This is also what is now being introduced in the Lebanon. Originally, the focus is on building an institutional capacity of a public procurement authority and an independent review mechanism. Additionally, with time, adding to the scope sectors like public-private partnerships, concessions, defense, new needs appear, both in terms of additional number of institutions needed to reflect this new legal environment, including concessions, defense, centralized purchasing, for example, and in terms of capabilities and capacities needed within the PPA structures, e-procurement, framework contracts, and sustainability. The state of play affects also the need of better coordination and policymaking, capacity building between the various institutions at the government level, as well as private businesses offering its goods and services. This, in a way, is a self-explanatory slide that, harmonizing the instruments available, the judiciary, the external audit, civil service is imperative. Mr. Daher mentioned also internal financial control as one of those key elements. So these are allies and safeguarding mechanisms that allow for the system's strength. There are traps too, of course, so avoiding duplication, different interpretations requires a lot of attention and coordination. The professionalization of the procurement function remains also a key priority. This is a topic where a lot of discussion is ongoing within countries, within international organizations, and in regional task forces. Efforts of funds have been allocated, but still the needs are big. It is more than just training of staff. It is about giving attention to the management or organization of the procurement function, ensuring that a sufficient and acceptable level of discretion is allocated to the contracting authorities. A level of decentralization usually works in favor of the system. Public procurement, at least in our view, is an economic function, and let's not forget that. So ensuring that the extent of prescriptiveness in the regulatory framework doesn't affect the operational functions negatively is imperative. Finally, mobilizing public and private training institutions in the provision of public procurement capacity building instruments remains key. The central policy-making institutions can't and should not do all. They tend to become slightly blindfolded with time. Very often, and this comes back to the economy principle of public procurement, there is too much risk aversion, resulting in insufficient outcomes. There's too much how to do compared to what is it we want to achieve. Here we need a continued discussion with our friends in the audit and control function so that a common understanding, what is it that we're trying to achieve here? A typical issue is the lowest price still being the predominant evaluation criteria. More quality-based evaluation factors are needed. And of course, training to be able to deal with those needs. And last, and but not least, the need of transferring more power and authority from the center of government to the operational level. This was already also mentioned many times. Integrity and accountability. We would insist on using this nomenclature and not necessarily anti-corruption and control. There needs to be a positive spin on this activity, otherwise there is a risk of blocking a basically economic activity. Certification, data collection can help in achieving these goals. Of course, creating an independent review mechanism that will safeguard the interests of the private sector is one of the fundamentals, and Lebanon is moving in that direction too. Effective performance measurement and developing indicators for measuring and monitoring are of growing importance. This is a more recent instrument and links to both integrity and professionalization. Other lessons or issues that we find useful and possibly of interest to you, you can see the list, but let me focus on three. The importance of e-procurement. This is one of the issues that is very often brought up as a silver bullet in many ways. But it has limitations, and there's a risk of overestimating its benefits. It has to be introduced with care and with acceptance by all the parts involved. PPPs are often neglected, okay? Where basically this is yet again the control of the budget and how this is directed into expenditure. And of course, there is a need to focus also on the support to the implementation itself, practical guidelines, not just legal compliance. So these would be just a few of our thoughts that have come up during our discussions with helping countries develop this. It is a moving target. It takes time. It changes. We really wish you all the best. And it's early days, but it's also a very exciting time. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gorecki. I think this also brought up very valuable additions, mainly, I mean, the overall environment, the legal framework, but participation of other stakeholders to have this working. I would like maybe to ask Ambassador Tarraf, before he maybe leaves us, if he would like to, let's say, to add something or to reply to some of the things that we have heard, or to add additional layer of observation.
No, thank you. I think the presentations show that the questions which are related to the implementation of the public procurement law are really complex ones, and that there are no easy fixes. There is, of course, an international discussion. There is benchmarking, there is best practice, and I think SIGMA is best positioned to enlighten us on those. But of course, it needs to be fitted into the Lebanese environment, and this requires really expert knowledge, and this requires attention. So as much as we can be proud that collectively we have been able to advance the topic, we still need to bring it home, which reinforces the point which I made earlier. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. I'll now pass to the questions of the audience. I mean, them as they are, and free to interject, and please also to engage in dialogue among yourselves, the speakers. I'm sure that many points that were raised by Mr. Gorecki and Karim Daher are are calling for some answers to Lamia, and inversely, it's free to do. The first question that we received is the implication, what is the implication of the law, of the public procurement law, on the private engagement? Is there a relation? Because we tend to think that public procurement is only related to the public sector, but what about the private in this regard? Who wants to take this question? Maybe you, Lamia?
Yeah, if I understood right the question, I would answer by saying that the private sector has the biggest stake in public procurement because it is at the other end. So the market is the buyer, the public market, the government is the biggest buyer on the market. But on the other hand, you have the service provider, the consultants, the suppliers. So this is the private sector. And the private sector, one of the principles of public procurement is competition. And this competition, why do we do competition? It's not a theoretical or a dogmatic, why we emphasize on concurrence, competition, it's because it brings efficiency, it brings innovation, it opens door to those who have bright ideas to bring and so that the public sector, which is the basically buying with citizens' money, with taxpayers' money, buys the optimum or the best products or services and ensures value for money. So it's a very important relationship that has to be built on principles and good practices and a lot of trust. The private sector has to know that if it's investing in building a good bid, there will be good response and professionals at the other end, and there will always be also procedures and regulations for discourse and complaints that ensures that there is a fair competition and there is a fair play. So the private sector has a big stake in learning about procurement because it's the biggest market. And when you say the biggest market in Europe, it's around maybe, depending on the countries, between 13 and 30%, maybe Piotr knows better. In Lebanon, it's more than 20% of public expenditure, according to our calculations at the Institute. And we were talking about only central government procurement. So this does not include what we call the agencies, so public autonomous agencies, and the municipality. So this gives you an idea about how big is the market. So private sector has a big stake in pushing for a competitive game. One of the things, and I will end there, that we are very happy to have done in this new law is, for example, to break one barrier called classifications of contractor. Karim might add on that. I mean, of course, it's a perfectible law, but I mean, there were barriers very difficult to break. Classification meant that contractors would be classified as A, as B, or C. We don't know with what procedures, with what criteria, and for how long a period. And sometimes this really posed a big problem for quality, but also a complete barrier for the entry of newcomers, new players. So we now moved to something much more in line with international regulations called pre-qualifications, and pre-qualification with set rules and rules aligned with the UN Central Model Law.
Okay, thank you, Lamia. Since both Karim and Piotr, in fact, has raised their hands, but Karim, you were directly addressed by, please go first and then.
Yes, thank you, Joe. We know that both contracting authorities and contractors are both subject to the Code of Ethics and the Code of Conduct, which is provided by virtue of Article 10 of the law. However, I have proposed, but it has not been taken into consideration at one stage, that the private sector, the contractors, should be subject and liable to a permanent survey, like for the audits of their accounts on a yearly basis. They should be subject to a survey and a report addressing all if ever they have complied or not with the obligations, the rules, and the Code of Ethics and the Code of Conduct. If they did not, if nothing has been made in this regard, they should be held liable, not only at the level of the company, but also at the level of the board of directors and the person who are in charge, the stakeholders of the company. And this will push the private sector to abide with all those rules and regulation, and will provide us with another tool and efficient tool to improve the implementation of the law. Okay, this is it, Joe.
Okay, thank you. In fact, my line is a bit bad and it's a bit cutting, so I have a hard time hearing you sometimes. Piotr, please.
I wanted to maybe give a concrete proposal, concrete idea that has been used elsewhere. I mean, in our view, it is obvious that equal engagement and equal participation of the private sector is key. Without it, no reform will be a success. It's just not going to work. So what was used in a number of countries was that when setting up a new system, usually including an independent review body, also a public procurement authority, and this is the case of the Lebanon, some kind of a more formal, less formal type of setup was created where the private sector could meet with the public sector to discuss policy. And this would not be at a conference. This would not be at a one-off event organized by somebody, but it was, in many countries, it was basically like an advisory board to the head of the public procurement authority. There would be identified a number of representatives from the private sector, maybe a mayor of a little city, maybe a representative of a utility, etc. They would meet every 3-6 months, would be given prior information concerning changes to the law, the functioning of the market, and this would allow them to basically discuss the reality of the functioning of the market, because it is a market in the end. Even under difficult times, better times I'm sure will come when there will be more of this. And that kind of dialogue is needed, especially at the beginning, in order to encourage and really engage both partners into the process.
Okay, thank you very much. Karim, there's a question that I think should be addressed to you, at least this is how I understand it. It's a bit of a tricky question. How will this law, or how does this law prevent politically exposed persons, what we call the PEPs, and their affiliated contractors to some loopholes in contracts and procurements?
This is what I have highlighted. I have highlighted in my presentation when I recommended 2 tools. One, the beneficial ownership, because we will detect and we will discover who are the beneficial owners of those companies, or if ever there is collusion with other person or conflict of interest. By the mean and using the beneficial ownership, the central beneficial ownership, and try to link it to other central beneficial ownership in the world and in the other partner countries, will be very useful to detect the PEPs. And on the other hand, if ever you waive the bank secrecy, like recommended by virtue of Article 5 of the Bank Secrecy Law and the decision number 17, which is a very, very, very important decision of the Council of Ministers adopted by the former government, it has recommended not only to review all the public contract that had been passed in the 3 decades, but also to waive the bank secrecy of all the contractors and all the persons that were stakeholders in this process. This is why, if we apply the laws, we have the laws now, and you know we have a very important scheme of laws, anti-corruption laws that have been adopted lately. And if we put together all those laws with the public procurement law, we may reach a result, but there should be a political will or foreign assistance in order to implement or to succeed in this adventure.
Thank you, Karim. There's a question here which is double-fold. much does this law require what we Lebanon marasim or application decrees? And at least relatedly for me, how can this law be applied if the government is not completely functional, like, for instance, the situation in which we are today? Lamia, would you take on this question?
Yes, thank you, Joe. And I think also Karim can complement it, and Piotr, because also both of them know the law. Like, we've tried in the design of the law to make it functional to the maximum we can without having to revert or with, let's say, reducing as much as possible the number of decrees that would be needed. That said, this is one of the most complex laws, one of the most complex reform. It has so many ramifications touching upon institutions. So you have two institutions to create, the regulator and the complaint body, the independent review body. And for these two, you need, of course, to have legislative decrees. There are also e-procurement, which requires a decree. There is a list actually of 11 decrees that we need to work on so that the public procurement law becomes functional. And this is why we kind of we are ringing the bell, saying that we do not have enough resources at this point in time to have the system ready to be implemented by August 2022. Initially, our proposal was to give this law a year and a half of preparation. We knew how tricky and how difficult the implementation and the preparation for the implementation process, but the parliamentary committee decided that 1 year is enough. We do not want to miss this deadline of August 2022, but the fact is, and the reality is, that we do not have a program supporting public procurement reform per se. I mean, there is no such thing today in Lebanon. We do not have a funding available, and we are trying to apply to many different funding opportunities. Our partners are trying to apply and to leverage the funding needed. But technically speaking, the law will, the principles will be, of course, applicable. The law will be applicable in terms of procurement method, for example, in terms of privileging open procurement, but the regulator will be there. The regulator will be there because we've designed in the law the transformation of the Directorate General of Procurement into the regulator, but we will need to have the regulator set, and we will need to have created the institutions. We will need to have also standard bidding documents, etc., etc. So this is why there is such a rush. This is why we are so much, working hard to have this deadline met. And our call for the international community is to help us. One, because the investment is worth pursuing. And second, because this is the first reform that is on track. And if this reform gets to show result, it will encourage us to go into other reforms, and especially the reforms that Karim talked about. The budget reform, which is key, the public accounting reform, which is key. So my call for all the partners is to join forces, join hands, so that we could make this deadline.
Okay, I think you.
Yes, I have the answer to your question, and the answer is in the law, in both Articles 115 and the Article 82. The Article 115 states that the minutes of application of this law shall be determined when necessary, by secondary legislation. And it states also that, however, the implementation of this law cannot be bound by the issuance of such secondary legislation, which means that the law is already in force. And in Article 88, it is mentioned that the tender board shall be dissolved. The current tender board, هيئة المناقصات, shall be dissolved, and the staff and officer thereof shall be transferred to the Public Procurement Authority. But it has been also foreseen that in case it is not established, the Director General of the Tender Board, the current Director General, shall be the President of the Public Procurement Authority. And until the Public Procurement Authority is appointed, the President of the Public Procurement Authority shall perform the duties thereof. This is the answer. It is in force already.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. The question here.
Yes, but if I might intervene, Joe,
please.
this is not enough. You will need a complaint body, you will need the standard bidding document, and you need all the rest. So, I mean, yes, but.
I agree.
Okay, okay. There's a question by Tamam Nakta saying that the Lebanese procurement law has historically been dominated by goods and works, and very less so for consultancy or services, operation, and etc. Is the law covering this lacuna or filling this lacuna?
Lamia? Well, very quickly, the old there was no procurement law. Very simply, there was a public accounting law, and the public accounting law was, yes, it talked about competitive procedure for goods and works, but not for consultancy services, for services in general. So all the services could be done legally, gré à gré. And this is what happened in most of the cases. So this was the old process. And now the new law is there. And first,
Can you? Sorry, I lost you. Hello. Disconnected? Is Lamia disconnected? Are you hearing her? Are you? Okay. And it's also lost, or Karim, are you here? Okay, we'll wait for them, but in the meantime, maybe Mr. Gorecki, a question. If there's a special jurisdiction or court system that will be charged to look at contraventions to this or to breaches to this law.
Okay, I'm not sure I heard the question fully, but basically the idea is in the Lebanon, like in many other countries where the judiciary doesn't have a strong enough position, and first of all, is not quick enough, frankly, to judge procurement cases. This is where many countries, I would say even the majority of countries that are reforming their procurement system, have created what we call an independent review body, which is a quasi-judicial body, you would say. There are different ways of appointment. You can do it through parliament, you can do it through whatever the institution is that appoints judges in that country. And yes, and then you basically regulate the rules of decision-making there. The average time of a decision of such a body in countries is anything between 30 and 90 days, which is much, much shorter than a judicial court would take place. And then it's a question of also developing a second instance, if you so wish. Usually that is something that we would propose. That could be then a normal court, and that could be limited, for example, to cases above a certain threshold, so very, very important tenders, or there can be other types of qualification of choice and so on. It's very much dependent on the legal tradition, the legal system of the country, frankly, okay? So it's impossible, there's no single standard per se. The mere fact that you're walking away from the judiciary and creating something that works for procurement, but is still independent enough in a way, is something that has worked in many countries, frankly, and allowed for procurement reform to move forward. If you rely on the judiciary, unfortunately, the experience shows that this would break the system, frankly.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Karim asked the question, but I can add also to it. The question was if whether there is a special jurisdiction court system that breaches to this law, or will it go to the normal, let's say, classical jurisdiction?
Sorry, I was interrupted in my connection. I didn't hear the question, but in reply to your question, Joe, I assume that you are talking about the complaint authority. You are talking about the complaint authority if ever it breaches the laws, the regular laws in force in the countries. I'm not a specialist of the administrative law, but I may say that this special laws at the moment provided for the fact that this law will prevail over the other law that are in contradiction with this law, and have provided for a special judiciary body. It is like the special investigation committee, the SIG, for the anti-money laundering. It is the same principle. If ever it works with the SIG, it may work with the complaint authority. This is the same. This is in my point of view, but I don't know. It is debatable. It is still debatable. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe the last, because the connection is stable everywhere. Probably to all of you, but mainly to you, Lamia, what will happen if the August 22 deadline is not met? What will happen to this law?
Okay, let me just compliment, if you allow me, before answering. And I'm sharing my screen, and this is, the little graph that, if you want, explains a little bit what happens with complaints. So today we have only the courts where you can challenge the complaint. The system now will be based upon a three-stage complaint system, whereby you complain first at the procuring authority, and then actually you complain at the review and complaints body, which transfers it to the procuring authority. There is a deadline for answering. You can, as a secondary recourse, if you're not satisfied, the aggrieved bidder might go to the review and complaint authority. At this point in time, something extremely important happens. Is that you have something called standstill period, meaning that the contract stops. You are not allowed, the process is stopped at every complaint stage, and this allows the complaint to be much more efficient. And if you're not satisfied, the aggrieved bidder can go and appeal to the State Council. So this is a little bit about how the system will work, and this is a little bit what is compliant with the international procedure. The institutions that will be concerned by the law, frankly, will be Public Procurement Authority. Is an important regulatory function, but the control of the Court of Audit and of the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Interior will be kept for the moment, but these institutions need to revise their procedures in the second stage, the second phase. The State Council will definitely become the last recourse after the Review and Complaint Authority, and throughout the Central Inspection Board will keep its administrative and financial oversight over the system. So that a little bit from the governance point of view of the law, I think we could advance the principles of integrity, good governance, and accountability. But all this, of course, theoretical until it is put to actual function, which brings us to your question, Joe, what will happen? Frankly speaking, I don't want to see another law that is put in an emergency law that says that the law 244 is going to be the application of the law 244 is going to be postponed until the system is ready. I don't want to see that. I don't wish to see that. And this is why, again, we all need to make the call for joining all hands and putting all the resources that we have from the private and public sector, but also from the think tanks and the civil society, so that we prepare the grounds for implementation on August 2022.
Okay, this of course has to another level of the discussion, which is much more the political level and the political context in the country, something that we are all following with a high degree of alarm and concern. And I'm sure that also Ambassador Tarraf is following this very closely with the interlocutors. I thank him for attending the entirety of this webinar. He was supposed to leave us earlier, but thank you very much, Ambassador Tarraf, for your attendance and your close following of, and I know that you are staunchly supporting these kinds of reform, and we'll have the chance to have you more often probably to talk about these. Thank you very much, Mr. for joining and for your consultancy support also for this from the SIGMA and from OECD. Thank you very much, Karim Daher, your enlightening remarks, and also we'll have you more probably at IFI issues related. And thank you very, very much, Lamia, for being the center of the discussion today, and also for having, of course, participated in the drafting of this very important law, and for all the work you are doing at the Institut des Finances, which is, I think, as we said a few minutes ago, that is keeping his capital alive in this country, meaning administration and the civil service. Thank you all very much, and thank you again for EuroMESCO, our partner in this event, and hopefully our partner in many other events and in other ventures with IFI. So we look forward to meeting you all, you audience. Thank you for your attendance in other webinars at IFI. Have a nice evening and see you later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Ambassador Tarraf. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Karim.